In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a woman's worth was measured in sons. For Nina Hayes, the silence in her womb was a death sentence handed down not by a judge, but by the cold eyes of her own husband. She was a beautiful but barren field, and when the final verdict came, she wasn't just cast out, she was traded, given to an Apache war band like livestock, an offering to quell the desert's violence. This is the story of her condemnation, her survival in a world she was taught to fear, and the warrior who saw not a failed wife, but a woman of fire, and told her the one thing she never expected to hear. The silence in the Hayes homestead was a living thing. It seeped from the sun-baked adobe walls and clung to the rough-hewn furniture Daxton had built with his own powerful hands. It was a silence thick with accusation, a quiet so profound it screamed Nina's failure from every corner. For 7 years that silence had been her constant companion, more present and more demanding than the husband who shared her bed. Daxton Hayes was a man carved from the very rock and dust of Redemption, Arizona. His jaw was square, his shoulders broad, and his eyes held the pale, unforgiving blue of a winter sky. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory. The double H and his word was law in the small, thirsty town that huddled in its shadow. He had built an empire from grit and sweat, but an empire needed an heir, a son to carry the Hayes name, to inherit the land, to ensure his legacy was etched not just in deeds, but in blood. Nina had tried. Lord, how she had tried. She prayed until her knees were raw on the splintered floorboards of the town's small chapel. She drank bitter secret concoctions brewed by an old Mexican woman on the edge of town herbs that promised to quicken the womb, but only left her sick and hollowed out. Each month, the arrival of her blood was a fresh grief, a private failure that Daxton met with another layer of cold disappointment. The townswomen, in their own cruel way, were no better. Their pity was a sharp-edged thing, wrapped in sympathetic smiles and hushed whispers behind cupped hands at the general store. Poor Nina, they'd say, their own children clinging to their skirts. Such a handsome couple. It's a tragedy. They saw her as a beautiful vessel exquisitely made, but tragically empty. A china doll with a crack running through its core. The pressure mounted with the passing seasons. The Apache, displaced and starved by the relentless creep of settlers, grew bolder. Raids on outlying homesteads became more frequent, their targets, shifting from livestock to the precious water sources. The tension in Redemption was a bowstring pulled taut, and Daxton's temper frayed with it. His obsession with an heir became intertwined with his fear for his legacy. An Apache arrow could undo a lifetime of work in a heartbeat, but a son would ensure it lived on. The final blow came on a Tuesday, under a sun so white and hot it felt like a judgment. Dr. Abernathy, a man whose hands smelled of carbolic soap and whiskey, visited the ranch. He was old, with rheumy eyes that had seen too much birth and too much death to bother with pleasantries. After a brief, humiliating examination of Nina in the sparse light of the bedroom, he delivered his verdict to Daxton in the parlor. Nina stood just outside the door, her ear pressed to the wood, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. "It's a barren womb," Daxton Abernathy said, his voice low and gravelly. "Some women are just fallow ground. I've seen it before. You could plow this field for another 20 years and never see a sprout." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the usual simmering silence of disappointment. It was the absolute chilling void of a final ending. I thank you for your time. Dr. Daxton's voice was unnaturally calm. Nina pulled back from the door, her hands clammy. She retreated to the kitchen, staring out the window at the shimmering heat rising from the parched earth. Fallow ground. The words echoed in the emptiness inside her. She was no different from the cracked, useless dirt beyond the fence line. That night, Daxton didn't come to their bed. Nina lay awake, listening to the coyotes cry, the sound a perfect match for the desolation in her soul. When he finally entered the room near dawn, he wasn't wearing his nightshirt. He was fully dressed in his riding clothes, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Get up, Nina," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "Get dressed. Wear something sturdy." A flicker of hope, desperate and foolish, sparked within her. Was he taking her away? To a specialist in Tucson? To a place of healing? She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the buttons of her plainest cotton dress. He led her not to the buckboard, but to 2 saddled horses. He handed her the reins of a gentle mare. They rode out as the sun bled orange and purple across the eastern mountains. They didn't speak. The only sound was the rhythmic clop of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Daxton rode ahead, a rigid silhouette against the growing light. He led her deep into the canyons, far from the familiar cattle trails, into a region of twisted rock and sparse, thorny vegetation that everyone, settler and Mexican alike, knew to be Apache territory. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Nina's numb confusion. "Daxton, where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice a croak. He pulled his horse to a halt in a narrow, shadowed ravine. He dismounted and turned to face her, his expression as hard and unyielding as the rock surrounding them. "There have been talks," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "With Chaitan's band." Chaitan. The name was a curse whispered in redemption, a ruthless Chiricahua leader who saw all white men as invaders to be eradicated. "They want peace," Daxton continued, though the words sounded like lies on his tongue. "They want a guarantee that their sacred grounds will be respected. They want a pact sealed not with paper, but with something binding." He looked at her then, and for the first time Nina saw not just coldness in his eyes, but a terrifying fanaticism. He was a man justifying the unthinkable. "What have you done?" she whispered, the reins slipping through her trembling fingers. "I have secured our future," he declared, his voice rising. "My future. The ranch's future. Chaitan has guaranteed safe passage for my herds, undisturbed access to the northern springs. In exchange for this peace, he asked for a gesture of trust, a gift, something of value to me." The world tilted. The canyon walls seemed to press in on her. She finally understood. The horse, the sturdy dress, this desolate place. It wasn't a journey. It was a delivery. "Me," she breathed the word stolen by the dry wind. "You have no purpose here anymore, Nina," he said, and the calm cruelty of it was worse than any shout. "You cannot give me a son. You cannot carry on my name. But you can do this. You can serve a purpose. You will be the price of peace. They will see you, my wife, living among them, and they will know the Hayes Pact is true." "You can't," she sobbed, backing the mare away. "Daxton, you can't do this. I am your wife." "You are a barren wife," he roared, the sound exploding in the quiet canyon. The mask was gone, replaced by 7 years of raw, festering rage. "You are fallow ground. Here at least your life will have meaning. You will buy my legacy." He grabbed the mare's bridle, his grip like iron. He pulled her from the saddle and she fell to the dusty ground. He looked down at her, his face contorted with a righteous fury that made her blood run cold. "They will be here soon," he said, his voice returning to its chilling calm. "Do not try to run. There is nowhere to go. This is your new home. This is your new duty." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away. He did not look back. Nina was left alone in the bottom of the ravine. She scrambled to her feet, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. She looked in the direction Daxton had gone, a speck of dust in the distance. Then she looked around at the towering, silent walls of rock. He was right. There was nowhere to run. She was in a cage, left as bait. She sank to her knees, the sharp gravel biting into her skin. The silence she had lived with for 7 years in her home was nothing compared to this. This was the silence of abandonment, the silence of the grave. She was no longer Nina Hayes, wife of a cattle baron. She was a thing to be traded, a ghost left to be claimed by the wilderness. And as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows, she heard a new sound, the soft tread of moccasins on stone. They were coming. They emerged from the rocks not as a howling war party, but as shadows given form. There were 4 of them, their skin the color of fired clay, their black hair long and unbound, save for simple leather bands. They moved with a fluid silence that was both terrifying and beautiful. The man in the lead was broad-shouldered, and his face was a road map of harsh sun and old conflicts. Scars webbed one cheek, and his eyes, black and piercing, held no warmth. This, she knew instinctively, was Chaitan. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her, as if she were a horse he was considering buying. He noted her dress, her soft hands, the terror that she was certain was written plainly on her face. He grunted something in his own tongue to the man beside him. The words were guttural sharp. One of the younger warriors stepped forward and grabbed the mare's reins. Another took Nina by the arm, his grip firm, but not brutal. He pulled her to her feet. She didn't resist. The will to fight had been bleached out of her by Daxton's betrayal. She was a leaf caught in a current, her direction no longer her own. They walked for what felt like hours deeper into the labyrinth of canyons. The landscape grew more alien, more hostile. The sun beat down relentlessly. Her town shoes, so practical for the dusty streets of redemption, were savaged by the sharp rocks. Her feet began to bleed, but she didn't cry out. A strange cold numbness had settled over her. This was a dream, a nightmare from which she would surely wake. The Apache camp was hidden in a wide, bowl-shaped valley, protected by sheer cliffs on 3 sides, and accessible only through a narrow, easily defended pass. It was a chaotic collection of wiki-ups, dome-shaped shelters made of branches and hide-drying racks. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies. Dozens of people warriors, women, old men, and shrieking naked children stopped what they were doing to stare as she was led through the center of the camp. Their faces held a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and raw hatred. She was the enemy. The White Eye. A woman of the people who were stealing their land, killing their game, and poisoning their water. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, the dust clinging to her tear-streaked face. She was shoved toward a wiki-up that stood slightly apart from the others. Chaitan spoke a few sharp commands, and the warrior who held her pushed her inside. The interior was dark and smelled of stale air and old leather. He motioned for her to sit, then left, pulling a heavy hide over the entrance and plunging her into near total darkness. Days bled into a meaningless cycle. Once a day, a grim-faced woman would bring her a bowl of thin, tasteless corn mush and a gourd of water. The rest of the time she was left utterly alone with her thoughts, which were a torment of their own. She replayed Daxton's words, his cold face the sound of his horse riding away, until the memories were worn smooth like stones in a river. The grief was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. After what she guessed was a week, the hide was pulled back, and Chaitan stood there, silhouetted against the bright daylight. He motioned for her to come out. Her legs were stiff, her body weak from inaction and poor food. She stumbled into the light, blinking against the glare. He pointed to a pile of buffalo hides, swarming with flies. He handed her a scraper, a sharpened piece of flint. The message was clear. Her time as a guest was over. She was now a slave. The work was brutal. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, were soon raw and bleeding. The stench of the hides was nauseating. The other women worked nearby, their movements economical and practiced. They ignored her, their silence a wall of condemnation. When she fumbled with the scraper, letting it slip and gouge a hide, one of them spat on the ground near her feet. Nina learned through Val and observation. She learned the rhythm of the scraper, the right angle to remove the flesh without tearing the skin. She learned to ignore the burning of her muscles and the searing pain in her hands. In a strange way, the mindless physical labor was a mercy. It left no room for thought, no space for the crushing weight of her sorrow. It was during this time that she first noticed him. He was not one of Chaitan's inner circle of hulking, boisterous warriors. He was leaner, quieter, with a face that seemed more thoughtful than aggressive. He often stood alone, watching the horizon, his posture relaxed but alert. His name, she would later learn, was Kael. He was a scout, one of the best. He could read the land like a book, discerning the passage of men or animals from a single broken twig or a displaced stone. Unlike the other warriors, who looked at her with contempt, his gaze was different. It was neutral assessing. He watched her work not with pity, but with a kind of detached interest, as if she were a strange, new animal he was studying. One afternoon, as she was struggling to haul a bucket of water from the muddy, depleted spring, her foot slipped on a wet rock. She fell hard, the bucket clattering away, the precious water splashing into the dust. The other women laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Humiliation burned her cheeks hotter than the sun. She sat there, her ankle throbbing, her dress soaked in mud, feeling the sting of tears. She didn't hear him approach. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see Kael standing there. He didn't offer a hand. He simply picked up the empty bucket. He walked to the spring, filled it, and brought it back, setting it down beside her without a word. Then he turned and walked away. It was a small gesture, but in her world of unending hostility, it was monumental. It was the first act of grace, however small, she had received since Daxton had left her to die. A few days later, she was grinding corn on a large, flat stone, a task that was monotonous and exhausting. Her technique was clumsy, her movements inefficient. Kael walked past, paused, and then stopped. He came and knelt opposite her. He didn't speak. He simply took a handful of corn and began to grind it. His movements fluid and powerful, using the weight of his body, not just his arms. He showed her how to rock the grinding stone, how to let its momentum do the work. She watched, mesmerized. After a moment, she mimicked his motion. The work immediately became easier. He gave a single curt nod and left. These wordless interactions became their language. He never spoke to her in front of the others, but he would leave a piece of dried meat on a rock near where she worked. He would subtly point out which roots were edible when they were gathered. He taught her through silent demonstration how to mend a tear in a hide with an awl and sinew. Nina began to change. The physical hardship was sculpting her into someone new. Her hands calloused over, becoming tough and capable. The sun browned her skin. She lost the soft roundness of her old life, her body becoming lean and wiry. But the biggest change was in her eyes. The terror was replaced by a watchful caution. The grief was still there, a hard kernel deep inside her, but it was now encased in a shell of pure, stubborn resilience. She started to understand their language, not by being taught, but by listening. She learned the words for water fire, meat danger. She learned the names of the people who despised her. She learned to anticipate the moods of the camp, to make herself small and invisible when Chaitan was in a rage. She was no longer Nina Hayes, the barren wife. That woman had died in the canyon. She was a survivor, a creature of this new harsh wilderness. And in the silent, observant gaze of Kael, she saw not a reflection of her failure, but the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time: respect. He wasn't looking at a white woman, or a slave, or a traded good. He was looking at someone who was against all odds, learning to endure. The harsh Arizona winter descended upon the canyons, bringing with it a biting wind that sliced through Nina's worn dress. The Apache, accustomed to the seasonal shift, were prepared. They reinforced their wickiups with more hides and insulated them with grass. The work of survival became more urgent, the mood of the camp more grim. It was during these cold months that the silent language between Nina and Kael began to find voice. The lessons became more overt, always conducted away from the prying eyes of the main camp. He would seek her out when she was gathering firewood at the edge of the valley, or checking snares he had taught her to set. "Not that one," he said one day, his voice low. It was the first full sentence he had ever directed at her in English. His accent was thick, the words carefully chosen. He pointed to a plant with deceptively bright berries she had been about to gather. "Sky gift. Looks like food. It is asleep with no waking." She dropped the branch as if it were a hot coal. How do you know English?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. A shadow passed over his face. "A man I killed long ago. He spoke much before he died." The statement was brutal in its simplicity, a stark reminder of the world she now inhabited. Yet he continued to teach her. He taught her the names of the constellations they used to navigate. He called them the Sky People. He showed her how to find north by the sun and the moss on the rocks. He taught her which animal tracks meant danger and which meant a possible meal. The lessons were always practical, focused on the raw mechanics of staying alive. In turn, she began to understand him. Kael was an outsider in his own way. He was respected for his skills as a scout, but he did not join in the boisterous gambling of the other warriors, nor did he participate in their drunken revelries when they traded for whiskey. He held himself apart, a man wrapped in a cloak of quiet sorrow. One evening, as a rare thin snow dusted the canyon rim, they found themselves sharing the small heat of a fire she had built in a sheltered alcove. The wind howled above them, creating a bubble of intimacy. "Why do you help me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her for months. He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I see a bird," with a broken wing that learns to walk. It is a strong thing to see. I'm not strong, she said the words, a bitter truth. I am what my husband called me, fallow ground. The confession slipped out, heavy with years of shame. Kael looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. A man who names his wife after dirt is a man who fears the sky. He said the words, a strange kind of poetry. He looks only down. He never sees the hawk. It was then that he told her his story. He spoke of his wife, Nalin, and his young son, Tarza. He described them not with flowery language, but with simple, devastating details. The way Nalin's laugh sounded like water over stones. The way Tarza would clutch his finger with a grip far stronger than his small size suggested. They did not die by the white man's bullet, Kael said, his voice flat. They died in a winter much colder than this one. A sickness of the lungs brought by the hunger. The buffalo were gone. The rivers were thin. The desire for a strong son, for a warrior to carry my name. It was a fire in my heart. He poked the embers with a stick. When Tarza's breath faded and Nalin followed him 2 suns later, the fire went out. It left only ash. He looked up at Nina, his gaze intense. The spirits give life. The spirits take it away. A man's name is written on the wind, not on a son's face. To want a child only to see yourself live on, it is a chain. It binds you to fear. The fear of ending. His words struck a chord deep within Nina. Daxton's obsession. The town's judgment, her own crippling shame. It was all born of that same fear, the fear of being forgotten. Kael, through his own immense loss, had found a different kind of freedom. Their growing bond did not go unnoticed. Chaitan tolerated it as Kael's skills were too valuable to lose, but others were not so understanding. A woman named Tiny, one of Chaitan's several wives, watched them with eyes like chips of obsidian. She was younger than the others, fierce and jealous of any influence outside of her own. She saw the respect Kael showed the white woman as an insult. The sabotage was subtle at first. The snares Nina set would be mysteriously empty. The small pouches of dried herbs she gathered would vanish. Then one day, it escalated. A valuable medicine pouch belonging to the camp's elderly shaman went missing. Tiny began whispering loudly, casting suspicious glances toward Nina. The white woman is bad luck, Tiny hissed to the other women. She has a hole inside her where a soul should be. She takes things to try and fill it. The accusation was dangerous. Stealing from the shaman was a grave offense. Chaitan, his face like a thundercloud, dragged Nina into the center of the camp. The entire tribe gathered their faces hostile. "Where is it?" Chaitan demanded in his own language, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Nina, terrified, shook her head. "I didn't take it. I know nothing of it." Tiny stepped forward. "She hides it in her sleeping robes. I saw her." 2 warriors moved toward Nina's sleeping place, a simple pile of hides in a shared wickiup. Panic seized her. She was being framed and she had no one to defend her. Her word meant nothing against Tiny's. "Stop!" The voice was calm, but carried an undeniable authority. Kael stepped into the circle. He stood between Nina and the warriors. All eyes turned to him. "Tiny lies." Kael set his gaze fixed on Chaitan. He did not look at Tiny. Tiny shrieked with outrage. "He is bewitched by her." The white witch has clouded his eyes. Kael ignored her. I was on the high ridge this morning, he continued, speaking to Chaitan. I saw Taini near the shaman's wickiup, and then I saw her go to the place where the outlanders throw their trash. He turned his head and pointed toward a deep crevasse outside the camp used as a refuse pit. The pouch is there. She threw it, hoping to cast blame. Chaitan's eyes narrowed, shifting from Kael to his fuming wife. He barked an order. A young warrior scurried off toward the crevasse. The camp waited in tense silence. Nina's heart hammered against her ribs. Kael had put himself in immense danger. To accuse the leader's wife was a challenge to the leader himself. After a few minutes, the warrior returned. In his hand, he held the shaman's medicine pouch smudged with dirt. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Chaitan's face became a terrifying mask of fury. He turned slowly toward Taini, who had gone pale. He did not raise his voice. He spoke a few quiet, venomous words to her. Then he backhanded her across the face with such force that she spun to the ground. He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and walked away. The crowd dispersed, leaving Taini sobbing in the dust. Kael looked at Nina. His face was impassive, but she saw in his eyes the confirmation of their bond. He had not just taught her to survive. He had defended her life at the risk of his own. Their alliance was no longer a secret whispered on the wind. It was a truth declared before the entire tribe. That night, the cold seemed less biting, the wilderness less hostile. She was still a captive, but for the first time she was not entirely alone. The snows melted, and the desert bloomed with a brief, violent explosion of color. The fragile peace of the canyons, however, was about to be shattered. A patrol of Mexican traders, who maintained a wary but consistent trade relationship with Chaitan's band, arrived in the camp with mules laden with salt cloth and iron goods. They also brought news. Their leader, a leathery man named Mateo, spoke passable English and Apache, making him a valuable source of information. As Kael and Chaitan negotiated for rifle cartridges, Nina lingered nearby, pretending to sort through bolts of cheap cotton. The big rancher Hayes Mateo said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. He is a man of rising fortunes. Took a new wife not 3 months past. A young thing, from up near the Gila River, daughter of another rich man. They say she is already swelling with child. The world, which had just begun to solidify under Nina's feet, dissolved into a dizzying vortex. A new wife. Pregnant. The words were like hammer blows to her chest. Daxton had not waited. He had replaced her, upgraded her as easily as he would a lame horse. The last stubborn ember of the woman she used to be. The part that still in its most secret heart felt the sting of a wife betrayed, flared into a roaring inferno of rage. It wasn't grief she felt. The time for that was long past. This was something colder, harder. It was the final severing of a rotten cord. She was truly free of him, and the liberation was terrifyingly fierce. Kael glanced at her as Mateo spoke. He saw the color drain from her face, only to be replaced by a chilling, stony resolve in her eyes. He knew without a word being spoken that the news had changed everything. The reckoning came sooner than anyone expected. Daxton Hayes, arrogant in his new life, his legacy now secured in the womb of his new wife Amelia, made a fatal miscalculation. The pact he'd made with Chaitan was one of convenience. With a son on the way, and his new father-in-law's influence providing added security, he no longer saw the need to honor it. When Chaitan's warriors went to collect the agreed-upon tribute, a small share of the calves born that spring, Daxton's men met them with rifles. 2 of Chaitan's youngest warriors were shot dead. The news hit the camp like a lightning strike. Chaitan's rage was biblical. He painted his face for war, his voice a raw roar of vengeance that echoed through the valley. This was not just a broken promise. It was an act of war, an unforgivable insult. He would not just raid the Hayes ranch. He would burn it to the ground. He would salt the earth and erase the Hayes name from the land. And he had the perfect weapon. That night he summoned Nina to his wickiup. Kael stood outside his arms, crossed his face a grim mask. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and fury. Chaitan stood over a crude map drawn in the dirt. "You know this place," Chaitan snarled, pointing a finger at a circle that represented the Hayes ranch. "You know the house, the barns, where the guards stand, where they sleep. You will guide us." It was not a request. It was a command. Here was the moment she had in her darkest hours fantasized about. The power to undo Daxton. The power to make him feel a fraction of the desolation he had inflicted upon her. Vengeance was a bitter cup offered to her, and she was thirsty. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will guide you." When she emerged from the wickiup, Kael was waiting. The moon cast long shadows, and his face was hard to read. "This path is a dark one, Nina," he said quietly. "Vengeance is a fire that burns the one who holds it. He left me to die." She countered, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "He erased me. He built his new life on my bones. Let him burn." And the new wife, Kael, asked, "The child she carries, are they part of your fire?" The question stopped her. Amelia, a girl from the Gila River, a girl who was likely as much a pawn in a man's world as she had been, and her child, an innocent. The fire of Nina's rage faltered, confronted by the ghost of her own deepest longing. She wanted to destroy Daxton's legacy, not slaughter a woman and her unborn baby. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not them." She looked at Kael, her mind racing. An idea, perilous and sharp, began to form. She could have her revenge, but she could shape it. She could be the architect of Daxton's ruin, not a participant in a massacre. "I will guide them," she told Kael, her eyes locking with his. "But you must trust me." She went back to Chaitan. She knelt by the dirt map and began to speak, her voice confident, her knowledge precise. She described the layout of the ranch in intimate detail. She pointed out the location of the new large barn where Daxton stored his winter feed and his most valuable tack. She noted the location of the bunkhouse where his hired guns would be sleeping off their whiskey. She described the holding pens where his prize bull and breeding stock were kept, and then she lied. "The main house has been fortified," she said, drawing a new line in the dirt. "He brought in stonemasons. The windows are barred. There are rifle ports. He keeps his new wife locked in the root cellar during any sign of trouble. It would be a waste of men and time to attack it directly. You would lose too many before you ever breached the door." She looked Chaitan in the eye. "His wealth, his pride. It's not in that house. It's in his herds, his bull, his barn. Burn his assets, scatter his cattle, and you take his future. You leave him with nothing but a fortified box and a pregnant wife he can no longer afford to feed. You leave him a king of an ash heap." Chaitan studied her as black eyes searching for any sign of deceit. But he saw only the burning conviction of a woman wronged. Her logic was sound, her hatred pure. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He liked the poetry of it. To leave the man aloof but utterly ruined was a more profound vengeance than a quick death. "It will be, as you say," he declared. "We ride at dusk tomorrow." As the war party prepared, painting their faces and chanting their ancient, chilling songs, Nina found Kael checking the fletching on his arrows. He was going. Not to kill, she knew, but to watch. To be there. "It is done," she said quietly. "I've aimed the arrow. I pray it flies true." Kael looked up at her, his expression unreadable. An arrow once loosed follows its own path on the wind. The raid began as a whisper, a slithering of shadows from the northern bluffs where the ranch's defenses were thinnest. Nina watched from a high ridge the coarse granite dwelt beneath her hands. Kael was beside her, a silhouette of calm resolve against the star-dusted sky. Below them, the Double H Ranch lay sleeping, a place that had once been her entire world, now reduced to a tactical map in her memory. A knot of ice and fire coiled in her stomach. This was it. The culmination of her rage, the final answer to Daxton's profound betrayal. Then the whispers became a roar. Torches held low until the last moment bloomed into existence like malevolent flowers. They weren't aimed at the main house, the stone fortress of her former life. They were flung into the massive timber-framed barns and the long, low bunkhouse. Flames licked hungrily at the dry wood, and within moments the night was torn open by a cacophony of splintering timber. The panicked, high-pitched screams of horses and the terrified bellowing of trapped cattle. The smell of burning hay and pine rose to their perch, a scent of acrid justice. Nina felt a grim, terrible satisfaction. She watched the heart of Daxton's empire, his assets, his future, his pride turn to incandescent orange and black smoke. This was not a blind massacre. It was the surgical dismantling of a man's legacy, the very thing he had traded her for. Let him watch it burn. Let him feel the heat of his own ruin. But as the chaos swelled, the clean lines of her vengeance began to blur. The detached satisfaction curdled into something more complex, more nauseating. The fire was alive, indiscriminate. The sounds were not just of destruction, but of terror. She had unleashed this. The cold knowledge of her own power was a heavy, suffocating thing. Suddenly, the front door of the main house was thrown open, spilling yellow lamplight into the maelstrom. A figure, silhouetted and broad, charged into the yard. Daxton. He wasn't cowering as she'd imagined. He was incandescent, with a fury that matched the fires around him, a repeating rifle held at his hip. And clinging to the doorframe behind him, her face a pale oval of terror in the flickering light, was his new wife. Amelia. Nina's breath caught in her throat. She was young, younger than Nina had been when she first came to this ranch. Her blonde hair, unbound, seemed to catch the firelight like a halo of panic. This was the woman who had taken her place, the vessel for the air Nina could never provide. And she looked utterly, horrifyingly fragile. Daxton began firing his shots, wild and useless against the fast-moving shadows. He was roaring his words, lost in the din, but his rage was a palpable force. It was the same blind, absolute fury he had turned on her. Seeing it now from a distance, Nina felt not a flicker of her old fear, but a profound, chilling pity. He was a king, raging alone in his crumbling kingdom. His presence, however, was an unplanned disruption. The raid's discipline fractured. A trio of Chaitan's younger warriors, their blood hot with victory, and whiskey traded from the Mexicans, broke away from the burning barns. They let out a unified, whooping cry and turned their attention to the real prize, the rancher himself. Their knives gleamed. The surgical strike was about to become a slaughter. "No." Nina whispered the word, a dry leaf in the wind. Kael put a steadying hand on her shoulder, but it was too late. The carefully constructed dam of her control broke. This wasn't her plan. Her revenge was on Daxton's pride, not his life. And it was not on the terrified woman in the doorway, or the child she carried. The thought of that innocent life being extinguished in this inferno of her making was unbearable. Propelled by an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she scrambled down the rocky incline, loose stones skittering away from her feet. Nina Kael's voice was a sharp warning behind her, but she didn't stop. She ran her Apache-made moccasins silent on the hard-packed earth toward the center of the storm she had created. She reached the edge of the ranch yard, her lungs burning just as the warriors cornered Daxton near the stone well. He had fired his last cartridge. His rifle was now just a heavy piece of wood and steel in his hands. He was panting, his eyes wide, with the primal fear of a trapped animal. He saw her then, emerging from the shadows into the hellish light. His jaw went slack. The fury on his face collapsed into utter soul-shaking disbelief. "Nina." He croaked the name, a ghost on his lips. He stumbled back a step, as if he'd seen an apparition rise from the grave he'd dug for her. You're with them." The warriors paused their momentum, broken by this bizarre tableau. A white woman, dressed in Apache leather, confronting their quarry. In that momentary silence, her voice, though shaking, cut through the crackle of the flames. "You left me in the dirt." "Daxton," she said, each word heavy with the weight of 7 years. "You planted nothing. You harvest nothing." His mind, unable to process the reality of her survival and betrayal, snapped. All his fear, his loss, his humiliation coalesced into a single, burning point of rage directed at her. If he was going to die, he would drag this specter of his failure into the fire with him. With a guttural roar, he dropped the useless rifle and lunged. He never reached her. There was a soft hiss, almost too quiet to hear in the din, followed by a solid thump. Daxton screamed a high, strangled sound and staggered back, his lunge collapsing. An arrow protruded from the thick muscle of his shoulder, its dark feather fletching stark against his white shirt. Nina looked past him. Kael stood 20 yards away, a bow in his hand, his expression calm and focused. He hadn't killed. He had simply ended the fight. Daxton crumpled to the ground, moaning, his hand clutching feebly at the arrow shaft. The fight was over. The warriors, seeing the moment lost and their prize claimed by Kael's arrow, let out frustrated yells and melted back toward the chaos, seeking easier spoils. Amelia, her face a mask of tears, and soot finally broke from her paralysis at the doorway. She ran across the yard, her nightgown trailing in the dust, and fell to her knees beside Daxton, her small hands hovering over his wound, unsure how to help. She looked up at Nina, her blue eyes wide, not just with terror, but with a dawning, pitiable confusion. In that instant, looking down at the weeping girl who had taken her place, Nina felt the last embers of her vengeance day, leaving behind only the cold, bitter taste of ash. There was no victory here. There was only a circle of pain, and she was standing in the center of it. This girl was not a rival. She was another victim of Daxton's obsession, another woman whose worth was tied to her womb. Kael was suddenly at her side, his grip firm on her arm. "It is done, Nina," he said, his voice low and urgent. We must go. Now." He pulled her back toward the shadows, away from the smouldering ruins of her past and the fresh grief of the present. The ride back to the canyon was a silent, grim affair. The triumphant whoops of the returning warriors grated on Nina's nerves. The victory felt tainted hollow. The fire had burned her past, but it had also illuminated a truth she couldn't ignore. Destruction was not a foundation upon which to build a new life. The consequences of the raid were as swift and brutal as Kael had predicted. The Double H was not just any ranch. Daxton's new father-in-law had influence that reached all the way to Prescott. The cavalry, once a sporadic patrol, descended upon the territory with the focused fury of a stirred hive of hornets. The canyons, once a sanctuary, became a death trap. Every shadow could hold a blue uniformed soldier. The hunting parties returned empty-handed or not at all. Fear, thick and sour, permeated the camp. Less than a fortnight later, the final blow came. A scout, breathless and bleeding, reported that a cavalry patrol had ambushed Chaitin and his personal guard in a narrow pass. There were no survivors. The news shattered the fragile unity of the band. Without Chaitin's iron will, old feuds and bitter accusations erupted. The camp fractured into paranoid, starving factions, and their fear and rage needed a target. All eyes turned to the white woman, the omen of ill fortune, and the scout who had protected her. That night, Kael led her away from the disintegrating camp, up a winding, hidden path to a cave tucked behind a shimmering curtain of water from a mountain spring. The air inside was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the fear-choked valley below. He had been preparing for this. Blankets, water skins, and parcels of dried meat were neatly stacked against a wall. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "This land is now soaked in blood. There is no peace here." Nina sank onto a blanket, the strength draining from her limbs. The weight of the past weeks. The raid. Daxton's ruined face. Chaitin's death. The hungry eyes in the camp. It all crashed down on her. She had won her revenge, but lost everything else. "He called me fallow ground," she whispered the words, raw and broken, confessing the deepest wound in her soul. "For 7 years, that was my name. That was my worth. An empty field, a broken tool. It's why he threw me away. And I became as barren and hateful as he believed me to be." She hugged her knees to her chest, the sobs she had suppressed for so long finally breaking free. Kael sat across from her, letting her grief pour out into the sanctity of the cave. When her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, he spoke, his voice a low, gentle murmur that seemed to push back the darkness. "I never wanted sons." She looked up, her tear-filled eyes, uncomprehending. "What?" When Narlin and I were joined, he began, his gaze distant, remembering. "I did not pray for a son to carry my name or prove my strength. I prayed for a partner to walk beside me. Taza." His voice softened at the name of his son. He was a gift, a beautiful, unexpected star in our sky. I loved him more than breath. But my life, my foundation, was Narlin. She was the one who stood with me when the winter wind was a blade. Her hand was the one I held when the summer sun was a hammer. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers, willing her to understand. A son is an arrow you fire into the future, never knowing where it will land or if it will find its mark. A partner is the one who stands with you while you draw the bow. She is the one who steadies your aim. The legacy of a person is not the blood they pass on like a deed to land. It is the life they build, the kindness they show, the warmth they share in a cold world. He paused, letting the words settle. Daxton Hayes did not lose a son in you. He lost a wife. He threw away the one person who stood by him. He was the one who was barren. His heart was a field of stone. The words were a revelation. They were a key unlocking a 7-year-old prison. Tears streamed down her face again, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of cleansing, washing away the poison of Daxton's judgment and her own self-hatred. He hadn't seen a failed mother or an empty womb. He had seen her. He had seen her strength, her pain, and her spirit. Kael reached across the small space and, with a gentleness that belied his calloused hands, wiped a tear from her cheek. His touch was not of pity, but of profound, shared understanding. "There are stories," he said softly, "from the old ones, of a valley to the north, far beyond the painted desert, a place the war has not yet touched. They say the water runs sweet from the mountains, and the game is plentiful. It is a long journey, a hard one. Many do not find it." He did not command or demand. He offered a possibility, a flicker of hope in a world consumed by darkness. Nina looked at him, at this quiet, wounded man who had shown her more kindness than any of her own. People who had seen value in her where she had seen only failure. She was no longer Nina Hayes. She was not the Apache's slave. She was a woman who had walked through fire and, with his help, had refused to be consumed by it. Her future was not an echo of her past, but a blank, untrodden path. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Will you walk beside me?" A rare, small smile touched the corners of Kael's mouth, reaching his eyes. "It is the only path I wish to walk." Before the first hint of dawn, they slipped out from behind the waterfall's misty veil. Two solitary figures, turning their backs on the blood-soaked canyons and the ashes of their former lives. They had nothing but what they could carry, and a shared, unspoken promise. They headed north, not toward a guaranteed sanctuary, but toward a choice. A chance to build a life defined not by bloodlines or legacies, but by the simple, radical act of two people walking side by side into the unknown together. The story of Nina and Kael isn't written in any history book. It's a testament to the fact that the most profound dramas of the Old West weren't just fought with guns, but in the silent, desperate battles of the human heart. It's a story about worth and how the value others place on us is often a prison. Nina was cast out for what she couldn't give, only to find a man who cherished her for who she was. A man who understood that a legacy isn't about creating an echo of yourself, but about building a life with a partner who stands with you. Their journey reminds us that true strength isn't about enduring pain, but about having the courage to walk away from the ashes and choose a new path, a new tribe, a new definition of family. If their story of resilience and unexpected love resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story that goes beyond the surface. And for more deep dives into the dramatic untold stories of history, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Thank you for listening.